So sometimes when prayer requests are shared, you have to be careful that we understand exactly what the request is. We don't know for sure sometimes. So it doesn't mean we can't pray for people. It just means that a lot of times we just really don't know what's going on in other people's lives, and sometimes we think we do. And that's what's happening in today's sermon when we look at the next section in Samuel. Samuel is a book that is really about a transition between the time of the judges and those spirit-led leaders in Israel to a king, to a group of men and women who rule over the country as kings, and it becomes a hereditary rule, and there's a big change. And last week we saw this picture of the problems that this created for Samuel, who the book is named after, but also that God recognized that the way that the people were asking for this king was not really the right, they didn't ask for the right motives, they didn't ask for the right reasons, and there's still this idea that God is going to bring about this situation. At the end of the chapter last week, Samuel says, now just he tells everybody what's going on. They reiterate that they want a king. He then sends everybody home, and that's where we're at. What we are at then is a significant change in the book of Samuel, in the story. Up till now, for the first 8 chapters, it's really been about Samuel and where he came from, how he got to be where he was. And now we're going to shift. Samuel's still around, and he's going to still appear, but he becomes not quite he's not really the main character anymore. And this is shown in the book itself. And this is, sometimes I try to help us all when we're reading an Old Testament story about how we should read it and understand what's going on. So we're going to go all the way back to chapter 1, and we're going to cover the first 8 chapters again. Just to remind you, no, I'm just kidding, we're not going to do that. We're going to go back to Samuel chapter 1, verse 1, and I just want to read you the first couple of verses, and then we're going to go back to chapter 9, and we're going to compare those two, right? So, this is 1 Samuel 1, verses 1 and 2, and it says, there was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite, from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jerome, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives, one was called Hannah, and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. So this is the introduction to the book. It's the introduction really to Samuel's life. This is where Samuel came from. Elkanah and Hannah are Samuel's parents. And the rest of chapter 1 describes Hannah's prayer, wanting a child, and then God's answer to that prayer. And in chapter 2, Samuel's the answer to that prayer. It keeps going on with the life of Samuel. But it starts by talking about Samuel's father, and then all of his ancestors, going all the way back, and then describing the family situation. Okay, see a general kind of picture. This is how it starts. Now we turn over to chapter 9, verse 1, and we see the same type of thing happen. In chapter 9, verse 1, it says, there was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zerar, the son of Bechorath, the son of Ephiah of Benjamin. Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. Same thing. Introduce this man, his name is Kish. He's not really the main character. The point is, his son is the main character, but it also describes all of their ancestors, and it describes the family situation or the situation that Saul's in. What this does is it gives us a signal that we're changing. We're not talking about Samuel anymore. Now we're going to be talking about this guy named Saul. And we're going to talk about what he is. Now we know from reading last week in chapter 8 that we have a pretty good idea that maybe, just maybe, Saul is the answer to the people's question, are asking for a king, right? Maybe we could assume that. I don't think I'm not reading ahead and trying to guess or anything. I'm just saying because it's introduced here, that's probably Saul is an important person in the story now. Okay? Everybody got that? We're not talking about Samuel so much, even though he keeps appearing in the story. But now we're going to be talking about Saul. And Saul is, according to this verse, he is the epitome of what everybody looks for in a leader. He is tall, dark, and handsome. We're going to see that he's got lots of money. When we think about people that we think have it together, Saul, on the outside, looks like that. And that's something that we have to remember as we go through. The fact that he's a head taller, I mean, it's one of those pictures, when you see a crowd of people, and then you see one person standing up in their head, everybody else's chin or head comes up to their chin. I mean, that's the picture. He is just bigger and more handsome. He says there was a young man, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, which is a pretty bold statement, by the way. So, this is who is now being introduced. But you'll notice also that, just as a side issue here, you never just bring a person, in the Bible, you rarely just introduce a person without telling you at least 5 or 6 generations of his family, which is what they do here. Because that's important to the picture. We're supposed to see Saul as a person who has deep roots in the community. He is, as we're going to see in the next couple of verses, he's part of a wealthy family. He's part of if we were reading this at the time, people would probably say, oh, that Kish, yeah, he's a pretty powerful guy in his own right. And we would recognize the family name. We know people even in Port Orford who have a family name, or in Oregon, or in the United States, that we recognize their name. And so when they come step in front of us, they just say, yes, I'm a Kennedy. And everybody goes, oh, a Kennedy, yeah. And then look at him and think, oh, he's an attractive young man, and he must be destined to be president of the United States. Because that's the way we tend to think. We tend to look at people's history and the things that they are on the outward side, and we make an evaluation. All that's to say is that later on, when Saul is presented to the people are going to say, oh yeah, that's what we thought a king would look like. Now, I'm going to give you a little heads up. Saul's not the king that they really want. It's just he's the king they want, but he's not the king they need. And he's not the king that God would have chosen for them. But God is going to give the people what they want, and this is the introduction to Saul. And I just thought that I would start by saying that when we think about the story, that the Bible emphasizes where we come from as much as where we are going. Notice when he presents this, there's a lot of this idea of this person comes from a family, or this person is like their parents, or like their father. And that assumption is something that the Bible plays into a lot. And when we look at Saul, one of the things that Saul has going for him is that he is from a solid family background. And he's got a lot of things going for him. Not the right things, but he's got a lot of things going for him. And some of the songs we sang this morning talked about how, we were one thing and now we're something else and we're something new. And we can probably make the argument up front that one of the problems that Saul faces is that he never is going to experience that redemption, that change. Saul's not going to be a different person after he becomes king. He is who he is. And that's not going to change. And that's one of the reasons why he's not the king that God wanted on the throne. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't have that background that he has. It just means that one of the things that you want from leaders is people who are who God wants them to be, not just who they've always been. And that's going to be maybe the crux of the issue with Saul. It isn't necessarily true that Saul is this terrible, evil person. But he's not the king that God wanted for his people. Some of you don't believe me. I can see you're all looking at me like, no, that can't be right. You must be wrong, Pastor. Because God chose this guy, so there must be something going on here. So let's just read some more. Starting in verse 3, we're going to actually read about all the way down to verse 13. So, here we go. You're going to you're going to know more about Saul this morning than you ever thought you would ever need to know. It says, verse 3, now the donkeys belonging to Saul's father Kish were lost. And Kish said to his son Saul, take one of the servants with you and go and look for the donkeys. So, he's rich, right? Got servants. And, well, we'll come back to the donkeys in a minute. So he passed through the hill country of Ephraim and through the area around Shalisha, and they did not find him. They went on into the district of Shalim, but the donkeys were not there. Then he passed through the territory of Benjamin, but they did not find him. These donkeys are just one step ahead of them all the way through. When they reached the district of Zuph, Saul said to the servant who was with him, come, let's go back, or my father will stop thinking about the donkeys and start worrying about us. But the servant replied, look, in this town there is a man of God. He is highly respected, and everything he says comes true. Let's go there now. Perhaps he will tell us what way to take. Saul said to his servant, well, if we go, what can we give the man? The food in our sacks is gone. We have no gift to take to the man of God. What do we have? The servant answered him again. Look, he said, I have a quarter of a shekel of silver. I will give this to the man of God so that he will tell us what way to take. Verse 9 is a parenthesis, and it's a little aside, and it says, formerly in Israel, if someone went to inquire of God, they would say, come, let us go to the seer, because the prophet of today used to be called a seer. Isn't it important to have that information? That's what he said, man of God. Verse 10, God, good, Saul said to his servant, come, let's go. So they set out for the town where the man of God was. As they were going up the hill to the town, they met some young women coming out to draw water, and they asked them, is the seer here? He is, they answered. He's ahead of you. Hurry now. He has just come to our town today, for the people have a sacrifice at the high place. As soon as you enter the town, you will find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. The people will not begin eating until he comes, because he must bless the sacrifice. Afterward, those who are invited will eat. Go up now. You should find him about this time. Wow. Kind of involved story. And you have a picture now of Saul in story form. One of the things that when we read stories like this is that they relate, the writer relates the information, and we're supposed to be kind of picking up on some personality traits as we read this. That's why they describe it the way they do. That's why they describe Saul the way they do. And so I'm going to pick up a few things out of here that help us kind of understand what kind of person Saul is. Now, I'm kind of reading into it, but at the same time, we have to realize that when these stories are told, they told the stories giving us the information that they wanted us to have, or when I say they, I mean the writer, and we're supposed to pick up on some of these things. That's the way you read stories. That the things that are told are supposed to give us some insight into who the person is. And so this is what's going on here. So first, the characteristics of Saul. The first one is, his name sounds like the Hebrew word for ask God for. So when we read the word Saul, if you knew your Hebrew, you would say, well, that sounds like Saul's the one asked for, because that's what his name means. And that's interesting in terms of, that's exactly what we're supposed to see here as we see Saul. His name sounds like the prayer that the people were asking for God. So when we look at Saul, we're supposed to see up front, this is probably the guy that's going to be the answer to the prayer that the people asked. That's the fun thing about biblical names, is that a lot of times they're tied to the story in that way. Secondly, the characteristics of Saul. His search gives the impression of an aimless or purposeless life. Now you're probably thinking, well, that seems like a stretch. But stop for a second and just think about what he's doing. We're going to find out in a minute, by the way, that this search has been going on for several days. So he's a young man who has no obligations other than to go look for his father's donkeys. And when he goes, he's just, at first he goes to the north, and then he goes, and then he's to this town, and he goes to this town, and it doesn't sound like he ever stops and asks himself something like, well, if I was a donkey, where would I go? It doesn't sound like he's even asking questions as to, has anybody seen any donkeys? It's just sort of like, it's kind of like some people do this, you're looking for your car keys, right? And so normally what you would do is kind of think, okay, when was the last time I had them? Where was I at? And go look there. But you may know people that don't do that. They just start looking. They just wander into one room and look under the pillow and walk over and open the closet and look and see if it's in there. And it's kind of this aimless, there's no plan to the life, there's no plan to anything, there's no purpose. It's just and that's kind of the picture of Saul. He's got a job to do. His father's given him a job to do, but it's almost like he doesn't really care if he finds them or not. He's just wandering around looking for them, yelling, "Hey, donkeys, where are you?" And so that's the impression that we get when we're reading this story. Now, we have to put the map up, because if I don't put a map up, some people get angry. They write me nasty letters and stuff like that. But no, that doesn't happen. I'm scared. That doesn't happen. This is a picture of these are all the different colors are all the different tribal areas. Okay, so there's Simeon. This green is Judah. This is Ephraim. This little blue right here, as you can see, is Benjamin. You can see this is Gilgal, and Bethel is up there. Geba right here, we're going to find out that's Saul's hometown. We'll find that out later. So this is where he lives, in the Benjamin. And it says he goes up into Ephraim. He goes up there and he looks through all of that. And then he goes back down to Benjamin, and he's just kind of wandering around all this central part of Israel. Okay? Why he doesn't go down south, we don't know, but we do know that he stays up there. There's probably a good chance that we have the Philistines over here, but the reality is that a lot of stuff that happens in Israel in the Old Testament all happens right in this area. That you get too far south and you start running into these other nations and these other peoples. You get too far north and you start running into them. And so they stay pretty much in that area. And it kind of goes with that idea that Saul just assumes that everything's going to be right in that area, in that middle part. He doesn't go way north. He doesn't go way to the east or way to the west or way to the south. He stays in that normal little area. In fact, almost everything that we read about in Samuel happens in this little group. Which, remember last week when we talked about Samuel's sons, and his sons were kind of a problem. So what does he do? Sends them to Beersheba, which is way down in the south. Get them. And I just want to say too, this is sometimes distances are an issue for us. We think that because you look at this and you see Ephraim up there, and you look at Beersheba, in your mind you have to think, I wonder how far Beersheba is from Bethel and from Geba, or where Shiloh and there, and the answer is it's about 30 miles. So some of you might have been looking at the map thinking, well, that's way down there. That's 500 miles away. No, it's not. It's 30 miles. Israel is a very small area. There's not a lot of land there. But if you're walking, 30 miles is a long way. You don't get in your car and drive like we drive to Shasta and climb the mountain. Well, we do that in just a weekend. But if you wanted to go from Beersheba all the way up there, you're talking about taking quite a bit. At first, you got to walk all the way, or if you have a donkey, you can ride the donkey. But the distances are fairly tight, but at the same time, the travel times are probably not that much different than we were thinking. So that was totally irrelevant to everything that I'm talking about today, but sometimes I just want to share some things so that we're thinking along the same lines. And by the way, I'm just thinking about the issue of donkeys, because I know you're all thinking about donkeys right now. There's a lot of discussion amongst those who study ancient times, because for us, a donkey is kind of a negative symbol, or even something that is kind of can be even seen as kind of humility. But there are reasons to believe that donkeys were considered luxury items at the time. That if you had donkeys, you were rich. It was a sign of being rich. It was a sign of nobility. It was a sign of a person, right? So and we come across this in Easter time when Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. There are some who think, well, that's talking about his humility. And he's, well, no, it's probably just as much Jesus making a very bold claim to being a king. Because kings ride donkeys. That's what they do. And so there's that, but there's a lot of debate about that. And so but it's one of those things that sometimes we kind of read into the Old Testament things that they wouldn't have. And so when we talk about donkeys here, we need to think probably in terms of wealth and nobility and the royalty, that kind of thing. So Saul is even though he's kind of, at this point, you're looking at him and thinking aimless, purpose. We're talking about a kind of a spoiled rich kid, right? So let's go to the next characteristics. He is content to follow the lead of other people. He goes, they're looking for the donkeys, and he says, okay, I think it's time to go home. And the servant says, well, maybe we should check out with the prophet first, the man of God. The man of God, we'll check with him. And he just says, okay, let's do that. And then he says, well, wait a minute. I'm the rich kid, but I don't have any money, or I don't want to spend any money, and I've ate all the food that I have, so we can't offer anything. And the servant says, I'll pay for it. So Saul is willing to follow the lead of his servant. Actually, he's supposed to be the one making the decisions, but he just kind of goes along with what the servant says. And then there's this whole picture of these women drawing water, and he goes to them, and they tell him where to go, and then he just follows what they say. So there's this picture of Saul then, who is content to just follow the lead of what other people say. Well, okay, you say to go do this, then I'll go do that. He's not doing, and it kind of goes with the aimless and purposeless thing. By the way, another sidetrack here, because there's all kinds of these things in the Bible. Saul does something that happens to lots of Bible characters. You know what that is? He meets a woman or women at a well. There's women drawing water. I like the way that, remember how they described, Kish had a son named Saul. So Saul is as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel. Remember that. And when we looked at the passage about the women, it says, as they were going up the hill to the town, they met some young women coming out to draw water. Okay, now, if you ever see a really good-looking young man standing by the well, and some young women come out to the well to talk, what do you think that's going to happen? Yeah, you're right. Young women are just going to ignore that guy completely. No, I don't think so. I think we're supposed to see. I mean, he uses the word young in both of those things, and you can picture what would happen. What would happen if, your teenagers get together, and there's the good-looking young guy who's rich, and you got the young women coming out. I mean, they're connecting, right? And that's what happens all the way through the Bible, by the way. Most of the time, when a Bible character meets women at wells, you're looking at a connection, a relationship. Abraham sends his servant out to find a wife for Isaac. Guess where the servant meets the wife for Isaac? At a well. Moses flees Egypt, and he runs out into the wilderness. Guess where he meets his wife? At a well. Shocking, right? But it's one of the things, and this is the lesson that we get from this, is that when you read these kind of scenes, we kind of, okay, you met some women, and you just kind of go on. But there is patterns to the way the Bible tells the stories and the things that they bring up. Jesus meets a woman at a well. It's she doesn't marry her, but she represents a believer. And who is a believer? The bride of Christ. So Jesus meets his bride in a spiritual sense at a well. Now Saul's not meeting, so this, I guess what I'm trying to say is, the women come out to, they know the stories too, by the way, so the women come out to the well, and we can kind of make the assumption that they're thinking, one of us has just met their match. I'm reading that totally into this whole thing. So, but isn't it fun to think about the Bible as being kind of alive, and there's stuff going on, and as we read this, we don't just kind of skip through these things, but we actually stop and think about what the story is and what the story is saying and why it uses the words it does. So, that's, he's content to follow the lead of other people. All right, I know what you're thinking now. You're thinking, Pastor, get on with the story. And so, verse 14, it says, I'm going to go on with the story. Verse 14, it says, they, that's Saul and his servant, went up to the town, and as they were entering, there was Samuel coming toward them on his way up to the high place. The man of God is Samuel. What a surprise. It's almost like the writer didn't want to tell you that, so he's talking about the man of God, and now we get there and find, turns out Samuel's the man of God. Oh, I didn't see that coming. No, you saw that coming, right? You knew it was going to be Samuel. Coming toward them on his way up to the high place. Now, the day before Saul came, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel. This is what he revealed. About this time tomorrow, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him ruler over my people Israel. He will deliver them from the hand of the Philistines. I have looked on my people, for their cry has reached me. When Samuel caught sight of Saul, the Lord said to him, this is the man I spoke to you about. He will govern my people. So Samuel has been prepared for this. Samuel has been, he just knew Saul was going to show up. And so he was looking for him, he was waiting for him. Saul shows up, and Samuel just knows this is the guy. God tells him, this is the guy. You're going to anoint him king. This is going to be the king. So this is at this point in the story, all of the things that we kind of assumed, all the kinds of things that we looked at are now part, we now realize that we were right about all those things. King Saul is the king, Samuel is the man of God, it's all going to come together. So, verse 18. Saul approached Samuel in the gateway and asked, would you please tell me where the seer's house is? Verse 19. I am the seer, Samuel replied. Go up ahead of me to the high place, for today you are to eat with me, and in the morning I will send you on your way, and will tell you all that is in your heart. As for the donkeys you lost 3 days ago, do not worry about them, they have been found. And I'm not even sure Saul has been worried about them, but that's a sign. And to whom is all the desire of Israel turned, if not to you and your whole family line? And Saul answered, But am I not a Benjamite from the smallest tribe of Israel, and is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me? Saul says, you've got to be wrong. This can't be me that you're talking about. I can't be the one that's the desire of all Israel. I'm not going to be the king. I'm from Benjamin, which is a small, remember the map that we put up there. Did you see how small the little piece of Benjamin was and how big all the other areas were? Not only that, now just go back and read the last couple chapters of Judges sometime. Maybe this afternoon. You've got nothing else to do today. Maybe you could read the Bible just for a couple minutes and see what happened to the tribe of Benjamin. They were almost wiped out completely. And so for him to be coming from the tribe of Benjamin at this point is, when he says we are the least of all the clans, that's what he means. He's serious. There's not very many of us. We don't have a lot here. How can I be that one? The other thing that I just wanted to notice is that Samuel is possibly the most famous person in Israel. Everybody knows Samuel. We've read a couple of places in the previous chapters that all Israel knows about Samuel. All Israel comes to him because he's the judge, and he travels from place to place. But when Saul meets Samuel, he says, he doesn't know who he is. He says, I'm looking for the seer. Do you know him? And Samuel has to say, no, I'm the seer. I'm Samuel. Don't you recognize me? He doesn't say that, but I'm thinking, that's what Samuel's thinking. Don't you recognize me? Can't you just tell who I am? And didn't you ask anybody? So the fourth characteristic of Saul is that he seems to be unaware of the world around him. He isn't really paying that much attention. He's not even apparently aware that the people have been asking for a king. He is just kind of oblivious. So I looked at these characteristics. His search gave the impression of an aimless and purposeful life. He's content to follow the lead of other people. He's unaware of the world around him. And I thought of one word, teenager. Some of you are laughing. Some of you are, and the ones who are laughing are the people who have teenagers or know teenagers. But that's kind of the picture almost. That Saul is this young guy. He's probably older than a teenager, actually, but he's still this young guy. He doesn't seem to have any plan for his life. He isn't really paying much attention to other people. He isn't doing anything that you would think of when you think of a king. Except, he looks good. And he comes from a wealthy family. Now, there's two things about that. First of all, teenagers do grow up, I mean, most times. They grow up and they mature and all these things go away. They do get a plan for their life. They do learn these things. Eventually they do get all these things. They become aware of other people. They do all of that, right? Some of you have teenagers and you're thinking, no, I'm not saying that, but it happens. We were parents of teenagers at one point and we thought these things and it changed. Okay, so it does change. So on one hand, we look at Saul and say, he still has potential. He could become the king that God wants. He could become the king that the people want. And so at this point, many of you know the rest of the story. You know what happens next, and you've read this before, you've heard it before. But if you're reading the story for the first time, I don't want you to give the impression that there's just no chance for Saul. That's not true. God calls lots of us to places where we're not prepared to be that person. When God calls people to be pastors, a lot of times the pastor isn't really ready for it. But God will provide what's needed. God will direct them. God will help them. And they'll make some mistakes and learn some lessons. And, those things happen. It's the same thing with being a parent. The baby shows up and you're thinking, now what do I do? But you learn. Nobody's actually prepared to be a parent. But you learn to be. So I don't want to put out there that Saul's doesn't have potential. Couldn't be the king. But what we're going to find out is that he doesn't. And this is going to be the problem. As he goes on through his life, we're going to see these same issues. He doesn't seem to have any purpose. He doesn't really understand what he's supposed to be doing. He's unaware of what's going on in other people's lives. He's content to follow the lead of other people. In fact, his son, Jonathan, will be more of a leader than Saul is. And so, that's what happens is you can kind of say that Saul doesn't mature. He doesn't grow up. He just gets older. And this is probably part of what goes on here with the king. The problem is we look at people and we think, they look good, they must be the ones. And that's what's happening. Verse 22, it says, Then Samuel brought Saul and his servant into the hall and seated them at the head of those who were invited, about 30 in number. Samuel said to the cook, Bring the piece of meat I gave you, the one I told you to lay aside. So the cook took up the thigh with what was on it and set it in front of Saul. Samuel said, Here is what has been kept for you. Eat, because it was set aside for you for this occasion from the time I said, I have invited guests. And Saul dined with Samuel that day. So they have a feast. Saul is the guest of honor. And he gets the thought. maybe you caught this, maybe you didn't, but they're eating this meal at a high place. It's part of the worship service. One of the things that we think about a lot of times is that when sacrifices were made in those days, that they killed the animal and then they put the animal on the fire and they burned it all up. But actually, that's not what happened. They only burned a small part of it. And then the rest of it was apportioned out to people and they had a meal. They actually ate it right there. And that's what's going on here. So, because Samuel's there, they have a sacrifice. And when they do the sacrifice, they take what's the part that's not given to God, or the whole thing's given to God, but God says, then eat the animal there in my presence. So it's interesting that God, when thinks of worship as God giving food to his people, which is one of the distinctives of Israelite worship, that God shares the gifts with his people. In other religions, the whole animal is burned up. Why? Because it's considered to be all the gods. God eats it all, or God consumes it all. But our God says, no, when we gather together as the family, we're going to all eat together. We're all going to receive something from God. Even when we do communion, body and blood of Christ is considered like a meal. And that meal is something that God shares with us. That's a completely different mindset than other gods are. God actually provides for his people. And that picture is in even this. They're eating together and they're having this, which is why when other prophets talk about heaven, they talk about it as a feast. It's a place where we're all going to be sitting at the banqueting table, and we're all going to eat together, and we're all going to enjoy and God's going to be there with us, and we're all going to share in it. That God isn't stingy in that. He doesn't keep everything for himself. He shares it with all of us. And that's what's going on here in this picture. In verse 25, it says, after they came down from the high place to the town, Samuel talked with Saul on the roof of his house. They rose about daybreak, and Samuel called to Saul on the roof, get ready, and I will send you on your way. When Saul got ready, he and Samuel went outside together. He had to get Saul up. You notice that? If you have teenagers, you know exactly what he was doing. As they were going down to the edge of the town, Samuel said to Saul, tell the servant to go on ahead of us. And the servant did so. But you stay here for a while, so that I may give you a message from God. Samuel says, Saul, we're going to go off by ourselves. It's just going to be the two of us. Not even the servant's going to be around. You just have the servant go get your equipment ready and get prepared to leave. We're going to go off by ourselves, and I'm going to give you the message from God. Chapter 10, verse 1, this is the message. Then Samuel took a flask of olive oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him, saying, has not the Lord anointed you ruler over his inheritance? That's the message. Saul, God's chosen you. God has picked you. And I am anointing you. Now, you know, what's interesting about this is that it's private. The only two people that know what's going on are Samuel and Saul. Next week, if you come back next week, we'll find out that even when other people ask Saul about what's going on, Saul doesn't tell them. This is silent. It's quiet. Nobody knows except Saul and Samuel. Don't know why. Doesn't explain why that's the case. But it is. And how this momentous moment is just the two people is a question of, well, what is God doing here? Why is God doing something that, why doesn't Samuel stand on the high place at the banquet and anoint Saul so that everybody could see? And we don't know. Except that apparently there's a process to be worked out where we're going to have to read more of the story to find out exactly what's going on. But this picture of Saul. So, the question then becomes, why is Saul the king? And I've already answered this a little bit, but the first answer is he has the looks and the status of a king. When eventually Samuel does stand before the people, which, as we're going to see, is a big process, people are going to say, yeah, that's the king. That's the king. The problem is, in a sense, that's the problem. I'm just going to real quick turn over a couple of chapters to chapter 16. And this is where Samuel anoints another guy. And his name is David. David's going to be the next king. So Samuel goes to David's house, and he meets some of his brothers. And when in 1 Samuel 16, verse 6, it says, when they, that's Jesse and his sons, David's brother and family, when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. He sees Eliab, and guess what? Eliab is like Saul. He looks like a king. And so Samuel isn't going to learn his lesson. The lesson is quit looking at the outside, because then it says, but the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height. I've already proven that to you. Remember Saul? Looks good, tall. For I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So this isn't the guy. And it's almost like when we read this passage, we're reminded of this. It's almost like God says to Samuel, you still haven't figured it out, have you? You're still looking at the outward appearance and not at the heart. You're not looking at who this person is. So why is Saul the king then? Why does God pick Saul to be the king? And the answer is because God is giving the people what they want. This is what the whole last story part was. There's lots of times in our life where God says, or where we say to God, this is what we want. We want this. And God says, well, this is going to cause some problems, and there's going to be some issues. And we say, no, God, this is what we want. This is what we want. This is particularly true before or when we're younger. But it's also, I think, the lesson from Samuel is we also don't learn this lesson we say or we think we know the answers to these questions, but we don't really. So one of the things God does over and over again is he answers our prayer. He says, you prayed it, and I'm telling you what's going to happen. And we say, no, God, keep doing it. We want you to answer this prayer. And then God gives us what we want. And God has to do that to prove something to us, to show us something. And that's what's going on here. Why is Saul the king? Because God is giving the people what they want. Our God shares things with us, as is shown by the feast, but God also kind of gives into us a lot. And we think, God, no, you should just always do what's best. And God says, well, sometimes you need to learn a lesson. Because we all start out like Saul, as a teenager. And we have to grow. And we have to mature. And we have to learn wisdom. And we have to learn to do these things. And if God just protected us from those things and never allowed us to make mistakes, never allowed us to do something that wasn't best, then we would never learn. Amen. God is not interested in you being, in him doing all the work in your life. God is trying to make you into something. Hallelujah. God wants to make Saul into something. Saul's not going to really learn the lesson, but that's what God wants. But we struggle with that. We think that, and then we just don't learn the lessons, and then we have to relearn them, and God has to keep doing the things over and over and over again, and that's why we talk about how patient God is, or how much grace God shows us. Because God is the hopeful God. He always thinks that this time it'll be different. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. And as we go through this passage about Saul, one of the things that we want to be watching for is, do the people of God actually learn the lesson? Or do they keep making the same mistakes? I'm not going to tell you the answer. You have to come back next week. Or as I usually try to remind you, you could just read some more of the Bible. Let's pray.